Weapons in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition are too basic and too boring, so let's fix them. Because I just did a video with Mr. Rex on how I fixed the armor system in Dungeons & Dragons and how it can be spiced up in different ways. And just released a full PDF with a full combat overhaul of armor, shields, martial actions, and weapons. But this specific video is over weapons and a little bit of martial actions having to do with these certain weapons, because I feel like each weapon should feel different when you use them. But first, we're going to get into why weapons are bland, homebrew methods I've used to fix them, and exact examples, again, based on those comments, which is a sneak peek of that combat overhaul PDF we'll talk about a little later in the video, how you can get your hands on it, overhaul your entire system too. All right, first, we're getting into all the issues with these weapons, is that these weapons should not feel the same. You should be able to mix and match weapons based on different scenarios and situations you find yourself in combat. Instead, martial classes are forced to having to pick feats or fighting styles that even those aren't specific weapons. They are two-handed weapons, not a great sword or a great axe. This literally eliminates the scenario of bringing two different types of weapons for different scenarios you might encounter that you want to cover your bases with. You literally are just choosing between a D12 weapon or a D12 weapon, which in most cases means players will just pick the weapon that has the highest weapon die, and that's it. I do actually think each weapon should feel different whenever you equip it and use it. It should have different properties, not because you chose a feat that you had to invest a lot of choice into. You can literally switch, even maybe, God forbid, mid-combat to gain the benefits of these different weapons. And if this is starting to pique your interest, just wait, because think about fighters. Fighters are proficient with all martial weapons, and they should be able to pick up and use all these different weapons, gaining all their different benefits. And I'm not going to get into it in this video, but I also have a variant rules for weapon proficiencies. Instead of just simple weapons and martial weapons, you actually get to choose between axes, swords, thrusting weapons, which I've lumped all type of spears into. I've lumped things together like puncture weapons of a morning star with all those little spiky points, and a pick would be in the same puncture category and have different puncture properties. Pretty powerful puncture properties, if I say so myself. But anyway, as a dungeon master, you could choose to be able to have players switch between weapons from one round to the next, or maybe they have to make a more tactical choice before the fight starts of which weapon they draw. But in the big picture, this moves away from just choosing the weapon that deals the highest weapon die, and I chose this because it's a D10 instead of what's my combat looking like. And we're getting into it later in this video, but they're also having different actions you can choose, that each weapon has a different action you can also use, which leads us into my solutions section. Number 2, solutions to these homebrews. These weapons I feel like should feel different, but how are you going to do that? How are you going to give that feeling to the player of using a sword versus an axe? Well, I did it in 2 different ways, 2 big ways. A passive, each weapon has a different passive that you're able to gain a bonus from just by wielding it. Each of these weapons deal more damage based on specific situations that they each would shine in. And this damage bonus is equal to your proficiency bonus, which at first is just gonna be +2, but then scales with you as you level up. The second thing I did with all of these weapons is give them some sort of action, some action economy where you can spend one of your attacks to get an extra effect from each of these different types of weapons. An axe has an axe attack. Those puncture weapons would have their own attack. Swords have some sort of flourish attack, and that thrusting weapon would have a big thrust attack specifically as an action. So you can choose to spend your action economy on this very specific cool thing that this weapon can do, and at the same time be gaining passives from all of its passive effects. And the third thing I almost forgot about is critical strikes. Here's how I handle critical strikes, which are going to blend this right into the third step, which are the homebrew solutions, the mechanics themselves. Whenever you land a critical strike with a slashing, piercing, or bludgeoning weapon, 3 different things happen, shown right here somewhere. And really quick, I did categorize weapons differently on slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning. Hammers deal bludgeoning damage. Swords are slashing damage. Axes are slashing damage. But puncture weapons and thrusting weapons are piercing damage. In this rule system, I do think that you can go crazy on me in the comment section, but I don't have swords deal piercing damage. Yes, I know you can thrust with a sword. And if you as a dungeon master want to describe that as piercing damage, cool, go for it. Let them be able to do that. That's fine. But I do think that slashing and piercing damage can get really watered down and washed away into who caresness if you have it like that. So I like to have the slashing weapons be slashing, the piercing weapons be piercing, but if you want to blur those lines, go for it. So the homebrew here is slashing weapons. When you deal a critical strike with a slashing weapon, they gain a bleed condition, which reminds me that the bleed condition is not in rules as written. It's something I'm adding into Alcanar's Almanac. And if you guys want to see all of the different conditions that I added to 5th edition, let me know in the comments down below. But the bleed condition is basically you gain the bleed effect, which the target gains the bleed effect, which is 1d4 necrotic damage every round until you're either able to make a medicine check or get at least 1 point of healing. But this gives slashing weapons that wound effect where they're bleeding out from that big gash across across their body. Now, piercing weapons are a little bit different. You impale them and they get impaled. It's not a big, huge gash, but it's a impale. So if you piercing damage crit a target, they become impaired, or they gain the impaired condition for 1 round, which is basically the next attack roll or any saving throw or whatever they make is then a disadvantage. So now critical strikes between these two different types of weapons feel different. You have a wound on one target versus you just got impaled, so everything you do is just at disadvantage for 1 round because you're fighting through it or whatever. But this is a difference between slashing and piercing. So this is also another reason why I separate them and I don't let swords deal piercing, because then whenever you crit, you have to ask them, oh, was that a piercing attack or a slashing attack? And just slows down the game. I like to separate them. But anyway, bludgeoning weapons, that's my favorite one. On a bludgeoning weapon critical, you get to choose as the player if the target flies back 5 feet or gets knocked prone. But that's just the critical effect type things that I have across all these weapons. And I did that only for the categories of weapon damage, not each weapon having a different critical. That's too much. But now we're going to get into the passives and active abilities for each of these 3 selected weapons of swords, axes, and hammers. This rep outfit still gets me. If any of this combat stuff sounds cool, if you like combat in Dungeons and Dragons, because honestly, who doesn't? That's one of the favorite parts of most people. This PDF is the PDF for you. It might be the best one that I've made so far. I put a lot into this, along with my team, along with a lot of influence from a bunch of different people I've been collaborating with, Mr. Rex, Zipper on Disney, a lot of very good homebrew creators. We have combined together to have this PDF. This thing has a ton of modular rules you can add into your game. I can't even list them all off right now. Is a weapon system going over every single weapon thing that I'm just talking about. A martial system, not just the different actions you can do with every single type of weapon. Bonus actions you can do to play defensively. Reactions you can do to play tactically with your friends. Combo maneuvers you can do together. That's just that part of it. The armor part of it, I have multiple different types of materials that your armor is made out of to give different properties to the most mundane of armors. And then an armor system to change the way that armor class works. And again, that's the whole video I did with Mr. Rex. That video will be down in the description. And a shield. I haven't even talked about the shield system. So many different shield abilities, maneuvers, properties you can add into shields. If you're watching this video live right now, this is available on my Patreon, along with bonus level up perks volume 2, which has 200 different feats you can customize your characters with. I try and give you guys as much value as possible, which is why I'm overhauling my Patreon starting in September with a bunch of huge changes. I'll have that post linked down in the description so you can see what's going on there, because I've never been able to give this much value. And thanks to your support from the current patrons that are already there and the support from the Kickstarter, I'm able to do stuff like this. So thank you guys so much. Now let's get back to those weapons. So now the 3 weapons that you guys chose in my little community posts voting poll that I did for what your favorite weapon is swords, axes, and hammers. I'm going to go over the passives and the action ability that you can do with each of these 3 weapons. For the passive effects of these weapons, you deal your proficiency bonus in damage if this certain situational thing happens. So first up is swords. What does it feel like to use a sword, and what type of passive would it have? You gain your proficiency bonus in damage if you deal damage to the same target in back-to-back rounds. This damage can happen only once per round, because then you can just keep getting the bonus damage, especially if you have multiple different attacks or whatever. So for example, if I attack this certain orc on my turn on round 1, let's say I only have 1 attack. I attack this orc right here. If I attack that same orc the next round, I get my proficiency bonus in damage against that target. If I switch targets, I don't get it. This also gets across that dueling effect of swords and challenging someone to a duel. And if you focus in on one target, that's going to be an help to you. So maybe if you're in combat and there's a bunch of different enemies, maybe you don't draw that sword because that's not the type of fight this is going to be. Axes gain this proficiency bonus in damage against any bloodied target or bleeding target. So if a target is below half health, in my table, whenever a target goes below half health, I say that they are now bloodied. That's just something I phrasingly say. So I call it a bloodied condition because they're below half health, and it procs this axe damage. So if you attack something that's closer to death than it is full health, you gain your bonus in damage to finish it off in this violent way. And bleeding, if a target is bleeding or has some sort of bleed on them, you deal bonus damage too. And as a side note here, I put scythes in the axe category, so they would also get this effect because I feel like that's fitting for these bladed decapitation weapons. Hammers, I love hammers on this one. You deal your proficiency bonus in damage to any target that is wearing metal armor. You're wearing metal armor and a huge hammer comes and strikes you in the shoulder plate. It dents it in on yourself. It's now stabbing you. Every time you raise your armor, this bent metal is impaling yourself as you move. It's a little extra damage. Now hold up, you might think that hammers, that's very specific. Hammers against metal armored targets. If you think about every type of thing you fight in Dungeons and Dragons, not all of them have metal armor that they're wearing, right? You could also say that it's a metal constructs. You could also rule as that. Again, that's you as a dungeon master. But also hammers gain this bonus in anything that's a petrified target or anything made of stone or golems or anything like that. And if you don't feel like that's enough as a dungeon master, you want to give those hammer wielders more stuff, they can also deal a proficiency bonus to prone targets on the ground. But again, now just using a hammer has so much more going on with it. You're thinking about what type of armor people are wearing. You're seeing petrified targets, a stone golem. I'm pulling out my Great Maul to go fight that big construct. Or maybe you get a crit with a hammer that deals bludgeoning damage and you choose to make them fall prone, and now you deal bonus damage to this prone target as your next attacks. And again, those passes I have for every single different kind of weapon there is. But now getting into the action, the active abilities you can choose to actively use while wielding these weapons. A quick shout out goes to Zipperon Disney. It's a collaboration of me and him putting our heads together on this. He has a PDF that he just released called Galder's Gazetteer, and I really do think it's a very close fitting to Alcanar's Almanac. There's a lot of different homebrew rules in there for players, a bunch of different classes and all this different type of stuff. Me and him have put our heads together. He's a great dude. We've been collaborating on a bunch of different stuff and been inspired each other from a lot of the different stuff that each other does. So one of the things that I got inspiration from him on is these active effects. He did this for slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning type weapons, having some sort of active effect, but I'm doing this for all different kinds of weapons. So on a hit, how all of this works across the board for all of these weapons. On a hit, once you have hit something, you can forego your extra attack. So yes, this would be for marshals with extra attack. Disclaimer here. So on a hit, you can forego that extra attack and you don't get your extra attack, but you gain an additional effect. This additional effect usually does cause damage and a little bit something else. But as a quick game design note, this also speeds up combat in ways, because instead of making an attack and making an attack, now you've made your 2 attacks, you dealt that damage, you move on. You make an attack, and once you hit, you get to choose, do I want to take an extra attack and swing at something else or the same target, whatever, or do I want to trigger this active effect of my weapon? But what are these active effects? So the first one up is the sword. If you hit a target in combat and you have an extra attack, you can burn your extra attack to make the target make a dexterity saving throw. If they fail that saving throw, they take 1 extra die of damage in the hit that you hit them with, and they have disadvantage on their next attack roll or ability check. So here's what this would look like. You attack that orc and you hit them. You would deal 1d8 damage plus, let's say your strength modifier is 5. So 1d8 plus 5, and then you could deal another attack and do another 1d8 plus 5. If you hit, you could attack and miss again. But how this works is you make that sword attack, you hit, you have that 1d8 plus 5, but before you roll damage, you can choose to trigger this extra effect. You spend your extra attack and you cause the orc to make a dexterity saving throw. Can he dodge this flurry of blows that you're coming at him with, right? These flourishes, okay? Makes the dexterity saving throw and fails. He fails that roll. Now you deal an extra weapon die of damage. So now it's 2d8 plus 5. You add that extra 1d8 and they have disadvantage on their next attack roll or ability check. And now you've dealt 2d8 plus 5 damage and they are on the back foot a little bit from this little flurry of blows you gave them. Sorry, monks, not flurry of blows. Don't worry, I got quarterstaff stuff and unarmed stuff too. Now moving on to axes. Axes are a little bit more gruesome since they're axes or scythes, whatever. You make your attack with an axe, and as soon as you hit, you can choose to have the target make a Constitution saving throw. And if they fail that saving throw, they take an extra die damage. Again, because I don't want you to burn your extra attack and you feel like, I want to deal damage. You still get your 1 extra die of damage, but axes give the target the bleed condition. Now stop right there. If that made you excited, respect, and I love you, because if you remember, axes, what are axes' passive effect? Passively, axes deal bonus damage. They deal an extra proficiency bonus and damage to targets that are bleeding. So you have an action now with, you see the playstyle I'm going for? There's actual mechanics, there's thinking, there's tactics. Axes have an ability where you could trigger as an action to give a target a bleed so that now all following attacks on that target deal bonus damage. Oh man, this stuff excites me. Moving on to hammers. Hammers, you attack the target and then you can forego your extra attack to gain 1 bonus. And you see how this is all very similar? It's all very similar. You forego that extra attack, you get 1 bonus die in damage, whatever the weapon die is, 1d12, 1d8, whatever it is. But you trigger a strength saving throw from the hammer. And if they fail, they take 1 extra die damage and they get knocked back 5 feet. Oh my God, this synergizes with a critical strike bludgeoning effect. So if you choose to make this attack with your hammer and critically strike and forego your second attack, gaining an extra bonus die of weapon damage, which would then turn into a critical, you already get knocked back 5 feet from the critical, and because you're using this hammer effect, now it's 10 feet. Ooh, I gotta calm down. This is too fun because it was so fun to make these for every single weapon. It spent so much time really thinking about the essence of these weapons. What does it feel like to play a hammer? You should shine against chunky targets that are like golems and stuff, or metal targets you're denting in their armor. It can go to flavor the descriptions too, and you can shine in these moments because you chose that weapon, or you got a collection of weapons, or you're a fighter that has 4 different weapons and you're ready for anything. So do you guys want to see a ranged version of this video? If this video gets 1,000 likes in the first 24 hours of this video going live, I'll do a follow-up video. Bob the World Builder, more inspiration from other collaborating YouTubers out there. I just showed up in one of his videos. He's doing a bunch of real life D&D statistics type stuff. So if we get 1,000 videos, the first 24 hours, I'll do a follow-up video for ranged weapons, a new crossbow. I have a whole new mechanics for crossbows and how they work, and bows. Or maybe you guys want to see a whole video where I show you my gun system of the different ways that I implement guns into Dungeons and Dragons. Matt Colville released a video on this, and I was like, oh man, I totally have a whole thing on guns. But comment down below, let me know what you guys think about that. Stay tuned for all the updates I have on my Patreon. I'm about to drop some huge news on that coming out September 1st. Everything's going to change. I have a whole bunch. I'm upgrading all the rewards across the board for everyone. Thank you so much for what this whole thing has become. I appreciate it so much. Stay creative, think outside the box. Peace.